After everything I built for this program, yeah, I took what I was owed.
The contracts you steered your own company and billed under a fake name over 3 years?
To his colleagues at Nike, Errol Andam was a trusted 17-year veteran running one of the brand's most visible programs. To federal investigators, he was someone else entirely, a man who invented a fake person to rob the company that made him.
You understand what that word means? I ran this program before half these people had jobs here. They never paid me.
The chair belonged to a federal interview room in downtown Portland. The Nike badge he had carried for 17 years had already been deactivated, and the name on the contracts that had built his second life, Frank Little, was about to be spoken back to him by a federal investigator who knew exactly who Frank Little really was. Errol Andam ran Nike's pop-up retail venue program. He picked the contractors, he approved the invoices, and he had been quietly approving them to himself. The IRS would seize $212,138 from accounts he controlled. A federal judge would order him to pay back more than $1, $6 million. And the entire scheme lived and died on 2 words: Frank, Little, real talk. Would you trust a 17-year employee at one of the most recognizable brands on earth to sign off on his own vendor invoices every week for years without anyone double-checking? Tell me in the comments, and hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because this channel covers the white-collar cases the mainstream business press quietly buries. We do this every single week. Errol Andam was born in Manila in the late 1970s. His parents brought him to the United States when he was 6, settling in southeast Portland on a quiet street near Mount Tabor, where the houses were small, the lawns were cut close, and the Douglas firs blocked out the rain. His father worked as a staff engineer for a regional utility. His mother kept the books for a Filipino grocery on 82nd Avenue. Discipline at home was strict. Ambition was assumed. The conversation at the dinner table was always about how to build something that lasted. By the time he was 12, Errol was running a paper route through the neighborhood and saving every dollar for one specific purpose: sneakers. Portland in the early 1990s was already a sneaker town, and the kid from Mount Tabor wanted to own every pair he could find. By high school, he was lining up outside Foot Locker at Lloyd Center for Saturday morning drops. He took a job at a small, independent shoe store on Hawthorne Boulevard at 16, $4.75 an hour, plus a 15% employee discount. And his co-workers remembered him as the one kid who could quote the suggested retail of every Air Jordan model going back to the original 1985 release. He graduated from Cleveland High School in 1995 and enrolled at Portland State the following fall. He studied marketing with a minor in business administration. His professors called him personable, organized, and unusually attuned to brand storytelling. He paid his tuition in part by working seasonal retail at the old Niketown downtown, the 4-story flagship on Salmon Street, where every employee was issued a polo shirt with a tiny swoosh stitched above the heart. He stayed 3 years on that floor. By graduation in 1999, his store manager had already submitted a recommendation letter to Nike's corporate recruiting office in Beaverton. He was hired the spring after graduation. Entry-level brand marketing coordinator, starting salary $38,500, badge number redacted in the eventual court filings. His first desk was inside a converted conference room in the Bo Jackson building, shared with 2 other new hires and a printer that jammed every afternoon. He was 23 years old and he had made it, and from that day forward, Errol Andam would never work anywhere else. The promotions came steady: senior coordinator by 2003, specialist by 2005, manager by 2009. By 2013, he was leading the North American retail brand marketing function for pop-up venues, with budget authority and vendor approval powers that, on paper, were supposed to be reviewed by a finance partner and a procurement liaison. In practice, the reviews were light, the trust was heavy, and Errol Andam had been there long enough that almost nobody questioned the names on the invoices that crossed his desk. His performance reviews from that era are quoted in the federal sentencing memo: demonstrates strong initiative and consistently delivers high-impact activations. Trusted partner across cross-functional teams. An ambassador for the brand. He bought a 4-bedroom house in West Lynn in 2008. He married a woman he had met at a Niketown holiday party years earlier. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. He drove a black Audi Q5 with a swoosh decal on the back window. He coached his son's youth basketball team at the Tualatin Hills Park and Recreation District. He volunteered at his church's youth program. He ran the silent auction at his daughter's elementary school fundraiser. Everyone who knew him thought they knew him. Almost none of them did. The Nike pop-up retail venue program was, by 2014, one of the most visible marketing functions inside the company. The concept was simple. Nike would identify a high-profile cultural moment, a sneaker launch, an all-star weekend, a film collaboration, a music festival, and build a temporary branded retail space to market. A blacked-out warehouse in the Brooklyn neighborhood of New York, a converted parking garage in downtown Los Angeles, a pop-up sneaker bar inside a host city for the NBA Finals. The venues were temporary, but the budgets were not small. A single mid-tier activation could run anywhere from $200,000 to $800,000 in build-out costs alone. A flagship pop-up tied to a major launch could climb past $2 million. The program's annual operating budget at its peak was reported in court filings as exceeding $25 million across North America. Because the venues were temporary, speed mattered more than process. A build-out contractor had to mobilize on tight timelines, often 2 to 3 weeks from concept to ribbon cutting. There was no time for a 30-day vendor onboarding cycle. There was no time for a competitive bidding process with 3 sealed quotes and a procurement committee. So the program ran on a roster of pre-approved contractors, and the manager who approved them, the manager who selected them for each individual job, and the manager who signed off on their invoices was the same person. That manager was Errol Andam. The internal control framework that should have caught this had one specific tripwire: a 2-signature requirement on any vendor payment above $50,000. In practice, Errol's invoices were structured to fall just under that threshold. He learned the number. He worked around it. A $48,750 invoice, a $49,200 invoice, a $47,900 invoice. Each one signed off by a single approver because the dollar amount did not trigger the second pair of eyes. The procurement team trusted him because he had been there 17 years. The finance partner trusted him because every project came in on budget. The marketing leadership trusted him because the pop-ups were beautiful, the press coverage was glowing, and the brand metrics looked exactly the way they were supposed to look. No one checked. No one had a reason to. The childhood friend's name was redacted in the indictment, but court filings describe him as a man Errol had known since elementary school in southeast Portland. The two had stayed close into adulthood. He was a contractor by trade, small jobs, residential remodels, the occasional commercial build-out. He owned a single truck operation out of a leased shop in Tigard. Sometime in late 2013, Errol drove out to that shop with a proposal. The childhood friend would open a new, limited liability company. The LLC would carry a generic, vaguely industrial name that did not appear connected to either of them. The LLC would be registered to a UPS store mailbox in Beaverton, not far from the Nike campus, but not on it. The childhood friend would be listed as the sole member. He would be the visible face. But the work would not actually be performed by his small operation. The work would be subcontracted out to the same independent build crews Nike's pop-up program already used. Errol would steer the contracts. The LLC would invoice Nike. The childhood friend would collect the payments, and the childhood friend would then move the majority of those payments back to Errol, minus a fee for his trouble. That was the structure on day one. It was already fraud. But it was not yet the full scheme. The full scheme arrived when Errol introduced Frank Little. Frank Little was not a person. Frank Little was a name Errol invented and dressed up with the minimum digital infrastructure required to make him pass as real. A Square account in the name of Frank Little, tied to a bank routing number Errol controlled. An email address with a free provider. A signature that Errol practiced on a yellow legal pad until it looked unhesitating and casual. Eventually, a second LLC layered behind the first, billing the first for design consulting and venue coordination services that did not exist. The flow looked like this. Nike approved a pop-up build. Errol assigned the work to his childhood friend's LLC. The childhood friend invoiced Nike, collected the payment, and kept his agreed-upon cut. The remainder moved through a series of intercompany transfers into accounts Frank Little owned on paper. From Frank Little's accounts, the money moved into personal accounts that traced, with patience, back to Errol Andam. The scheme started small. A $12,000 inflated invoice in 2014. A $34,000 phantom consulting fee later that same year. By 2015, it had grown to high six figures annually. By 2017, it was clearing seven figures. Errol's personal financial picture quietly transformed. He paid off the West Lynn mortgage. He bought a second home, a vacation property at Black Butte Ranch in Central Oregon. He traded the Audi for a new BMW X5. He upgraded his wife's car, then upgraded it again. He took the family to Tokyo, to Manila, to Maui. He paid private school tuition for both children in cash, in full, in August, every year. Nobody at Nike asked how a senior brand marketing manager on a six-figure salary was paying off second homes in cash. Nobody at his credit union flagged the deposits because the deposits arrived in business account amounts from what looked like a legitimate vendor relationship. Nobody at the IRS noticed because Errol filed his returns on time every year, and the Frank Little income was buried under enough layers of corporate paperwork to look ordinary. He had built a parallel financial life. The man who approved the contracts and the man who collected on the contracts had the same fingerprints. And for almost 5 years, nobody noticed. We're heading into the part where the numbers finally stopped adding up. Before we get there, if you've made it this far, you already know this channel covers white-collar cases differently than the mainstream business press. Subscribe and hit the bell. We post every week, and the next one is already in the pipeline. The thing that finally tripped the wire was not an external complaint. It was not a competitor calling to ask why they had never been invited to bid on Nike pop-up work. It was not a whistleblower. It was, according to the federal sentencing memorandum, a routine review of vendor concentration inside the pop-up program. Sometime in early 2018, a finance analyst inside Nike's brand marketing organization pulled a standard quarterly report. The report broke down spend by vendor across each major program. For the pop-up venue program, one vendor name appeared with unusual frequency. The Childhood Friends LLC was capturing a disproportionate share of the program's contracted work. The analyst flagged it for her manager. Her manager flagged it for procurement. Procurement pulled the file. The LLC had been onboarded in 2014 with a single page of basic paperwork and an approval signature from Errol Andam. Its tax ID checked out. Its insurance certificates were current. Its registered business address was a UPS store mailbox. That last detail was the one that made procurement look twice. A multi-million-dollar Nike vendor with a private mailbox for an office. Procurement asked for a site visit. The childhood friend stalled. He gave them an address for a shop in Tigard. The shop existed, but when a procurement officer drove out to verify, the man who answered the door had no idea who was funding the lease or where the Nike work was actually being performed. He was a subtenant, not the owner, not connected to any of the build-outs at all. The internal review widened. Procurement began pulling individual invoices and tracing the payment trails. They found Frank Little on the third Friday of February 2018. A square account in the name of a person nobody at Nike had ever heard of, billing the Childhood Friends LLC for amounts that closely tracked the markup on Nike's pop-up payments. By the end of that day, Nike's general counsel had opened a formal internal investigation. By the end of the following week, the investigation had been referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Oregon and to IRS Criminal Investigation in Portland. Errol Andam was placed on administrative leave on a Monday in early March 2018. He turned in his badge at the front desk of the Mia Hamm building. He drove home in the BMW X5 he had paid for in cash and he did not yet know that federal investigators had already begun pulling Frank Little apart, line by line. He was terminated for cause 2 weeks later. The federal investigation had only just started. The lead agent on the case was a senior special agent from the IRS Criminal Investigation Portland Field Office. The case file was opened formally in late March 2018. The first subpoena went out within 10 days. The subpoenas pulled bank records, Square account records, LLC filings from the Oregon Secretary of State, lease documents from the UPS store, and call detail records from 3 different cell phones. Investigators traced every dollar that had moved through the Childhood Friends LLC from the date of its formation. They followed the money out of Nike into the LLC's operating account through a series of intercompany transfers into Frank Little's Square account and out the other side into a checking account at a small credit union in Beaverton. That credit union account was in Errol Andam's name, his real Social Security number. The thread that ran from the fake person back to the real one was sitting in a routing number that any forensic accountant could pull in an afternoon. Investigators interviewed the childhood friend in May. He brought a lawyer. He cooperated within an hour. He told them everything. The structure had been Errol's idea. The pricing had been Errol's call. The work had been steered by Errol. The childhood friend had been paid a fixed percentage, ranging from 8 to 15% of the gross invoice, depending on the size of the job. He had never met Frank Little. He had never been told Frank Little existed. He had assumed the markups were Errol's personal cut for the project, which technically they were, just not in the way he had assumed. The childhood friend agreed to plead to a single conspiracy count in exchange for full cooperation. He turned over his communications. The communications were, as one investigator later described them in a court filing, remarkably preserved. There were text messages going back to 2013. There were emails sent from Errol's personal Gmail account discussing how to set up the LLC. There were photographs of bank deposit slips. There was, most damning of all, a single text exchange from October of 2016. Errol, 10/14/2016. Run the next 2 through Frank. Keep the LLC clean for the audit window. Friend, 10/14/2016. What if they ask who Frank is? Errol, 10/14/2016. They won't. Frank's been on the books for 2 years. He's invisible. Friend, 10/14/2016. Copy. The IRS executed a search warrant on Errol's West Lynn home on a Thursday morning in July 2018. Agents seized 2 laptops, 4 external hard drives, a desktop tower from his home office, 3 iPhones, and a banker's box of paper records from a closet. They also seized $212,838 in cash and account balances they had already frozen across 2 banks. The forensic analysis of the laptops produced the rest of the case. Spreadsheets tracking the scheme month by month. A document titled FL Signature Practice. A folder containing scanned copies of fabricated identification in the name of Frank Little. A note to self in which Errol had written, in his own words, "Don't get sloppy. The whole thing breaks if Frank breaks." Frank broke on a Thursday in July. The interview happened in a federal building in downtown Portland on a Tuesday morning in August 2018. Errol arrived with 2 attorneys. He wore a charcoal suit. He had lost weight. The recording began at 9:14 a.m. The lead agent placed 3 documents on the table: a Square account statement in the name of Frank Little, a photograph of the signature practice document recovered from the laptop, and a printout of the October 2016 text exchange. "Mr. Andam, can you tell us who Frank Little is? I would like to consult with my attorneys for a moment. Take your time. A 4-minute break." The recording resumed. Frank was a workaround. The procurement process at Nike for new vendors was broken. It took months. We had projects that needed to move in weeks. I created a way to keep things moving. That was the intent. The intent was to invoice your employer under the name of a person who does not exist. The intent was to keep the work flowing. The brand needed the activations. I delivered the activations. Nobody at Nike was harmed by this. The activations happened. The press coverage happened. The sales numbers happened. Your employer paid more than $1.5 million to a person who does not exist. The work was performed. Some of the work was performed. The markups, the consulting fees, the design coordination fees billed through Frank Little, those did not correspond to any real labor. I disagree with that characterization. The interview ran another 40 minutes. Errol's responses tracked the same pattern throughout. The system was broken. He had fixed it. The brand had benefited. The numbers were a technicality. He never raised his voice. He never apologized. He referred to the scheme, in his own words, as a creative solution to a procurement problem. He was indicted 3 weeks later. The indictment came down from a federal grand jury in the District of Oregon in early September 2018. The charges included wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to defraud his employer. The case was assigned to a United States District Judge in Portland. The assistant U.S. attorney handling the prosecution was a veteran of the office's white-collar crime unit. The defense filed a series of pretrial motions, including a motion to suppress the laptop evidence on grounds related to the scope of the search warrant. The motion was denied. A second motion sought to exclude the childhood friend's testimony on cooperation witness grounds. That motion was also denied. Errol Andam entered a guilty plea in the spring of 2019. The plea agreement covered a single count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, with the government agreeing not to pursue additional counts in exchange for cooperation and a full restitution commitment. Sentencing was set for the fall. The pre-sentence report calculated a guidelines range driven by the loss amount. The government argued for an upward variance based on the duration of the scheme, the abuse of a position of trust, and what the prosecution memorandum described as an absence of genuine acceptance of responsibility, evidenced by the defendant's continued framing of the offense as a procurement workaround. At sentencing, 3 Nike representatives delivered statements on the company's behalf. The first described the impact on the brand marketing team's morale. The second detailed the audit and compliance overhaul the company had implemented in the wake of the discovery. The third addressed the personal betrayal felt by colleagues who had worked alongside Errol for more than a decade. He sat in our meetings. He approved the work. He shook our hands. He was, in every single one of those interactions, also the vendor he was approving. We did not know. We trusted him because he had earned that trust over 17 years. We now understand that he spent every one of those years preparing to do this. The judge addressed Errol directly before pronouncing sentence. Mr. Andam, you have, throughout these proceedings, characterized this offense as a workaround. It was not a workaround. It was a sustained, deliberate, and sophisticated fraud against an employer who paid you well, promoted you steadily, and trusted you completely. You created a fictitious person. You signed his name. You billed your employer under that name. You did this for more than 4 years, across dozens of transactions, while sitting in meetings with the colleagues you were stealing from. The court does not accept your framing, and the sentence in this case will reflect the seriousness of what you actually did. The court imposed 31 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, restitution of more than $1,600,000, forfeiture of the $212,838 already seized. Errol Andam reported to FCI Sheridan, a low-security federal facility about an hour southwest of Portland, in early 2020. His projected release date placed him back in the Beaverton metro area in late 2022. The pop-up program at Nike was restructured. The 2-signature threshold was lowered. Vendor onboarding now requires a physical site visit, a beneficial ownership disclosure, and an annual conflict of interest attestation from the responsible marketing manager. And somewhere in a digital archive inside the Mia Hamm building, a folder still exists labeled with a name that meant nothing to anyone for almost 5 years and now means everything. Frank Little. This case was layered. But the case on the right-hand side might be the most brazen white-collar betrayal we have ever covered.